my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm doing a somewhat belated wrap-up of the Hugo nominees this year for Best Novella, at least the ones that I read. Now, the Hugo Awards have already happened on August 11th in Glasgow. I was there, I'm home now. We know what won in this category, as in all the categories. However, it's never too late for a good wrap-up and analysis. At least that's what I'm living by here on this channel. So I'm gonna talk about these books and how I ranked them and why. So the best novella shortlist this year was Thorn Hedge by Kingfisher, which was the winner. Life Does Not Allow Us to Meet by Nghi, translated by Alex Woodend. Mammoths at the Gates by Nghi. The Mimicking of Known Successes by Malka. Rose House by Arkady Martine. And Seeds of Mercury by Wang Jin Kang, translated again by Alex Woodend. There were 2 Chinese novellas in translation on this shortlist, and I chose not to read either of them. I was watching for reviews of these from people that I follow, and the things that I heard made me think that A, they weren't necessarily the type of science fiction I would enjoy, and B, that regardless of the quality of the original work, the English translations weren't great. That's unfortunate. It's good to see international work showing up on the Hugo shortlist, but for me, I made the call that neither of these were going to be worth my time when I was trying to cram in a lot of books in a very limited window. Now, the first of these books on this shortlist that I read, chronologically speaking, was the eventual winner, Thorn Hedge. I am, at this point, always going to be pre-ordering a new Kingfisher fairy tale book. This one is a Sleeping Beauty retelling, and so I read this in August of last year, shortly after it was released. It's now been a full year since I read this. Never too late for a wrap-up. This I liked a good deal. It was predictably Kingfisher-esque, but it just wasn't quite the standout for me that Nettle and Bone was. I say that as someone who reads a lot of fairy tale-esque fantasy. That means my standards are fairly high. If I had to pitch this to someone in one sentence, I would say it's a changeling twist on Sleeping Beauty. Our protagonist, Toadling, is the fairy character who is responsible for the curse. We learn about her backstory and learn that she was born human and gained her fae-like characteristics because she is a changeling who was raised in fairy by like swamp fae, and that actually changes you, so she no longer seems to be human, and she does have some minor magical abilities. She can, for example, transform into a toad and survive for centuries without seeming to get older. When we meet her, she has been guarding this cursed castle for a very long time as history has passed around her. This is historical in its setting. I'm not sure we ever learned like an exact time and place, but there are references to real historical events that have passed. And Toadling has spent all that time guarding the castle to prevent, questing would-be heroes from discovering it and awakening the princess. She does have very good reasons for this, as we learn when one such questing hero approaches and decides to befriend Toadling, and she tells him her story, and maybe a little bit of romance ensues. I haven't seen much discussion of this as a changeling story. That might be because some reviewers are considering that to be a little bit too much of a spoiler, but for me, every time I read a book that is a changeling story, I have to think a little bit about disability and or ableism vis-a-vis the story that is being told, because of the understanding that historically changeling lore probably comes from a place of people reacting to the existence of disabled children in their families and communities, and the question of why are these children like that. It's a convenient answer to say, oh, that isn't really my child, that must not be my human child must have been taken away by the fairies, and this fae thing was left in my child's place. And so, as a fantasy reader, it can be helpful to be mindful of how authors are using changeling lore in that historical light. And there are two changelings in this book, because of course for every human whisked away to fairy, there's a fairy child left in human realm and vice versa. And this is, like, from me, not meant as like a call out. This is more an attempt at a discussion, because I haven't seen people talking about this book in this light. If you view Toadling as the changeling in the story, obviously she is this unconventional fantasy heroine, someone who seems monstrous and strange but is relatable and lovable. And if you read the princess primarily as Sleeping Beauty, then this is a subversive take on this fairy tale. But then if you read this through the lens of the princess being the changeling, I don't know that it passes the sniff test quite as cleanly. But I gave this 4 stars. I think it's one of the better twists on Sleeping Beauty I've read. And then every other book I read on this shortlist after this one is gonna get measured up to this one. So let's see how that goes. In February of this year, I read The Mimicking of Known Successes by Malka. This is the first in a sci-fi mystery novella series. This takes place on the planet Jupiter, which has been colonized by means of like a connecting series of floating platforms above the surface of the planet that are connected by railroad rings, basically, that loop all the way around. This infrastructure is plot relevant. We follow a detective named Masa, who is kind of our Sherlock Holmes character, and her ex-girlfriend named Platy, who's sort of the Dr. Watson character. Masa is tasked with solving a mystery disappearance that might be a suicide or a murder, and it takes her back to the university town where Platy still lives and works, and she ends up enlisting Platy's help in solving the case for her connections at the university. The primary thing I liked about this was the vibes. Despite the fact that living on these, like, relatively barren and lifeless platforms orbiting Jupiter, because Earth is uninhabitable, is objectively a pretty bleak future for humanity, this manages to be surprisingly cozy. Like, the question of how to make Earth habitable again so that we can return there someday looms large throughout this story. It's a big theme of the ultimate conflict of the book. It's what Platy has dedicated her career to studying, just this small portion of, and yet this university town comes across as rather charming. There are tea shops and good restaurants and winding alleyways and comfortable home apartment living situations, and it all kind of has this vintage noir-esque vibe. Like, obviously there is advanced technology, but it's only used for certain things. A lot of everyday tasks are accomplished without that tech. So it's this interesting loop of, like, me, the reader, fantasizing about living in this cool place, whereas they are all fantasizing about living on Earth, which is where I live. One thing that frustrated me a little while reading this, which is a matter of expectations versus reality of what this book was going to be like, is that because this has, like, the very romancy silhouette type cover that's like these two characters framed against a background, I went into this sort of expecting more romance than I got for the vast majority of the book. Like, their past relationship is definitely a thing that, like, undergirds the plot and the reasons they didn't work out in the past and the ways they've both changed and maybe are willing to give it a try again. But this doesn't lead with the romance the way I kind of thought it would from the cover design. I did pick this up when I was in the mood for something like sapphic and romancy. The other thing that is, like, a very minute, technical, I guess, craft thing that didn't quite work for me is the fact that the prologue starts off in third person, writing about Masa. And then the rest of the book from chapter 1 onward is first person from Platy's perspective. And after that prologue, I had a hard time sort of switching over to my brain fully understanding that we were supposed to be in Platy's head. And I think for me, there just wasn't a strong enough tonal shift between those two perspectives. Like, that first-person POV from Platy didn't have quite a strong enough character voice, so that it took me a few chapters to like really adjust to the fact that the first-person POV was Platy and not Masa, after my brain had like latched onto the idea that Masa was the protagonist in the prologue. Again, this is a book I liked. I gave it 4 stars. There is a sequel, and I'm just like not totally sure if I actually liked it enough to read the second book. If it's nominated next year, I'll absolutely read it though. So for me, this was a close call, but this sneaked in for me a little bit ahead of Thorn Hedge. I thought it had some bigger ideas, but this was very close. Oh, and I should say, I did read both of these before the nominating deadline, and they did both make my nominating ballot. My favorite book on this shortlist, though, ended up being Mammoths at the Gates by Nghi. This is the 4th Singing Hills cycle novella. It is my favorite so far. I am caught up with the series. I did have to read When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which I skipped over last year to get to Into the Riverlands. And while I think those 2 books, When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain and Into the Riverlands, it doesn't really matter what order you read them in. I think you probably should read all 3 of the prior books before getting to this one. These are set in an Asian-inspired fantasy world. The big empire that dominates politically in these stories is definitely Chinese-inspired, but there are also other cultures represented in this world building. In this book, we follow a traveling cleric named Nghi, who belongs to an order that undertakes the task of collecting, recording, and preserving stories and histories. Each of these books is a story about stories or about histories, but each of them approaches that theme in a slightly different way, and each of them has a slightly different genre and storytelling approach. This is the first book in the series where we spend time at Singing Hills, which is the abbey that she grew up in and works for. And we learn a lot more about them and their childhood than we did in any of the previous books. This is a lot more personal of a story in that way for the protagonist. In this book, she returns home after many travels and discovers that the abbey is essentially besieged by 2 sisters with their war mammoths, while the senior clerics are all away on a mission. One of their mentors, who basically raised them since childhood, has passed away, and these 2 sisters are from this person's family and are demanding that the body be handed over to them for their sort of burial as opposed to the abbey's sort of burial. And Nghi's friend, who has been temporarily elevated to the position of head of the abbey, is trying to manage this very stressful situation. Meanwhile, did I mention there are also magic talking hoopos in these books? In this one, Nghi is reunited with their magical talking hoopoe companion, Almost Brilliant, who has been raising a chick. This story is just so intimate and poignant. It's a story about grief and the stories we choose to tell and remember about the deceased. And it's about whose stories are listened to and recorded as opposed to just being there to record the stories of others. It's also about friendship and how those relationships change over time. And it's just lovely and tender and beautiful. This again, 4 stars. But this one goes to the top of my rankings. For me, this was my #1 pick. It's also, I think, my favorite book in the Singing Hills cycle so far. All of them have been 4-star reads for me because I really like the themes of the series and I like Nghi's writing. But this one just feels like it's got a little bit of that extra something special in it for me. I read this one in July, and I am just realizing now that I lied when I told you that I was going to go in the order that I read the books, because I read Mammoths at the Gates and Rose House like very, very close to each other, but Goodreads is telling me I finished Rose House first. I finished Rose House on June 30th and Mammoths at the Gates on July 12th. And I am just remembering Rose House last because it was my last place on this list. And that's kind of painful for me because in terms of like prose writing style, this has just like the most lush, incredible vibes. This is definitely the most literary feeling of the books that I read on this shortlist, but I'm not really sure to what end. This is a near-future feeling science fiction story about an artificially intelligent house called Rose House that was designed by a great world-famous architect and left to his protege when he died, his estranged protege who wants nothing to do with him or with Rose House anymore, but he stipulated that she is only allowed into the house for like a certain number of hours or days a year. And we are to understand that there is like this elite society of the world's architects who are all like clamoring to get inside and like catalog Rose House or whatever. At the beginning of the book, the house itself reports to the local police precinct, as it is legally required to do, that there is a dead body on the premises. The question is, who is this and how did it get there if no one except Celine is allowed inside and she was not in the country at the time? Our second protagonist, along with Celine, is Maritza, who is the police detective on the case. And I'll say right out, if you're going into this expecting it to be a murder mystery, you're going to be disappointed. From the book description, I had a pretty good idea of who I thought the murderer was. It shocked me that no one in the book jumped to this same conclusion as quickly as I did. And then it surprised me even more that after seeing significant evidence that I was in fact correct, the book goes to great lengths to obfuscate it at the end and present this alternative to what might have happened. And spoilers, it's not a mystery story because the mystery doesn't get solved. And that was very frustrating to me because I still think I know whodunit. I'm not sure you even ever learn the identity of the victim definitively. What it is more than a murder mystery is it is a haunted house story where there's an AI instead of a ghost in the house. It's this non-human presence that is spooky, that doesn't want you there, and that can't necessarily be reasoned with in a normal way. And there are some honestly very good spooky vibes that also didn't make sense to me once I took a step back. Like this idea that somehow being in the house and talking to the house could drive you insane. Like that makes sense if you're actually dealing with the supernatural, but I don't know that it translates to sci-fi well. With Maritza, who is the character who does eventually get inside the house, despite the fact that she's not supposed to be there, by like coming to the agreement with the house that she's there in her capacity as a police precinct and therefore she isn't a person. There is this sense that like she emerges deeply changed by this experience, but it didn't totally make sense to me why. I don't know, maybe there was something more to get out of this, but if there was, I didn't get it, and I was frustrated. So with 3 stars, this slipped in at the bottom of my rankings, leaving me with Mammoths at the Gates on top, and then the Mimicking of Known Successes, and then Thorn Hedge, and then Rose House. Obviously, that's not how the award ended up going, such is life. But I will say, looking at the stats, Mammoths at the Gates came second, so I'm happy with that. And then Rose House came fifth with one of the Chinese finalists, Life Does Not Allow Us to Meet, in sixth place. So there are some ways in which that final ranking aligns with my rankings. I probably should have been able to predict that Thorn Hedge would win. I think there was a strong sentiment this year in one way or another to award finalists who had been somehow slighted by last year's fiasco. And definitely there was a bitterness to the fact that Ursula Vernon's win for Netherland Bone happened under such unfortunate circumstances where it's hard to see that win as legitimate. I think people wanted to give her a legitimate win this year. I think it's a little unfortunate that it happened for a book that really I don't think was as good as Netherland Bone, but I'm never going to be mad at fairy tale fantasy winning Hugo Awards, you know? I honestly, before the awards ceremony, thought this was going to go to Mimicking of Known Successes because of how much love I had seen for that book. So I am surprised to see that it ended up all the way down in fourth place. Anyhow, let me know what you think of these results. Let me know what you thought of these books. I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.